On the afternoon of February 15, 1997, a Saturday that felt like any other in the small town of Bowling Green, Kentucky, two teenage girls walked out of a local shopping plaza and disappeared into the winter air. The sun was beginning its slow descent over the quiet streets of Warren County. Parents were picking up groceries. High school students were making weekend plans. And somewhere in that ordinary afternoon, beneath the surface of routine and normalcy, something terrible was already in motion. What no one realized at the time was that the events of that single afternoon would haunt this community for more than 2 decades. That the answers everyone searched for were closer than anyone imagined. And that when the truth finally emerged, it would come from a direction so unexpected, so impossibly close, that it would force an entire town to reconsider what they thought they knew about trust, friendship, and the people we let into our lives. Before we continue with this story, take a second to hit subscribe and drop a comment where you're watching from. We'd love to know how far these stories go. This channel brings you true crime stories that are often forgotten, cases that deserve to be remembered, voices that need to be heard. Your support helps us keep digging into the cases that time tried to bury. Now, let me take you back to Bowling Green, Kentucky, in the winter of 1997. Bowling Green sits in the south-central part of Kentucky, a town of rolling hills and quiet neighborhoods where everyone seemed to know everyone else. In 1997, it was home to about 50,000 people, large enough to have shopping centers and a university, but small enough that a missing person was still front-page news. It was the kind of place where parents let their teenagers go to the mall on Saturday afternoons without much worry. Where neighbors waved at each other from driveways. Where nothing truly terrible was supposed to happen. 16-year-old Jessica Hammond and 18-year-old Kacie Woods were best friends. They'd known each other since middle school, bonded over shared classes and late-night phone calls and the particular kind of closeness that teenage girls build when they feel like no one else understands them quite the way they understand each other. Jessica was a sophomore at Greenwood High School, quiet and thoughtful, the kind of girl who kept a journal and loved reading poetry. She wore her brown hair long and often tied back in a ponytail, and her friends described her as gentle, someone who avoided conflict and preferred to listen rather than speak. Kacie, 2 years older, had just graduated the previous spring and was working part-time at a clothing store while trying to figure out what came next. She was more outgoing than Jessica, quicker to laugh, more comfortable in social situations. She had blonde hair that she was constantly changing, experimenting with different styles and colors. Her family said she lit up a room when she walked in. She was restless, eager for something more than what Bowling Green could offer, but not quite sure how to reach it. On that Saturday in February, the two girls made plans to meet at the Greenwood Mall, a modest shopping center on the north side of town. Jessica told her mother she'd be home by dinner. Kacie told her father she was going shopping with Jessica and maybe they'd catch a movie. These were the kinds of plans that required no special permission, no extra concern. Just two friends spending an afternoon together. Witnesses later recalled seeing them inside the mall around 2 in the afternoon. They were spotted at a music store, flipping through CDs. They stopped for pretzels at the food court. They seemed relaxed, unhurried, laughing about something only they understood. Nothing about their behavior suggested fear or urgency or anything out of the ordinary. Sometime around 3:30, they left the mall through the main entrance. Security footage from the parking lot, grainy and distant, showed them walking toward a dark-colored sedan parked near the edge of the lot. The footage was too poor to capture faces or license plates, but investigators could make out two figures approaching the vehicle, pausing briefly, and then the car pulling away. That was the last confirmed sighting of Jessica Hammond and Kacie Woods. When Jessica didn't come home for dinner, her mother, Linda Hammond, wasn't immediately concerned. Teenagers lost track of time. Maybe they'd decided to catch that movie after all. But when 6 o'clock became 7, and 7 became 8, and there was still no phone call, Linda felt the first stirrings of unease. She called the Woods family. Kacie wasn't home either. By 9 o'clock, both families were calling friends, checking with anyone who might have seen the girls. By 10, they were calling the police. The Bowling Green Police Department took the report seriously from the beginning. Two teenage girls missing together was unusual. There were no signs of a runaway situation. Both girls had good relationships with their families. Neither had packed bags or withdrawn money. Their cars were still at their respective homes. Whatever had happened to them had happened suddenly, unexpectedly. Detectives began retracing their steps immediately. They interviewed employees at the mall, reviewed security footage, spoke with anyone who'd been in the area that afternoon. The investigation moved quickly in those first hours, driven by the knowledge that time mattered most in cases like these. Every hour that passed reduced the chances of finding them safe. The community responded with the kind of urgency that small towns are capable of when their own are threatened. By Sunday morning, volunteers were organizing search parties. Flyers with Jessica's and Kacie's photographs were printed by the hundreds and distributed throughout Warren County. Local news stations ran their pictures on the evening broadcast. The story spread through Bowling Green like wildfire, families gathering around dinner tables to discuss what might have happened, parents holding their own children a little closer. What detectives learned in those first days painted a picture of two girls who were exactly where they were supposed to be, doing exactly what they'd said they would do, until they simply weren't. There were no warning signs. No threatening phone calls or suspicious encounters in the days leading up to their disappearance. No known conflicts or enemies. They were just two ordinary teenagers living ordinary lives in a town where nothing like this was supposed to happen. But beneath the surface of that ordinary afternoon, something had clearly gone terribly wrong. The investigation intensified as the first week passed without answers. Detectives from the Bowling Green Police Department worked around the clock, following every lead, no matter how small. The parking lot where the girls were last seen became a crime scene, officers combing through trash bins and storm drains, searching for anything that might provide a clue. The mall security footage was enhanced and analyzed frame by frame, but the distance and quality made it nearly impossible to identify the vehicle or anyone inside it. Detective Raymond Cole, a 15-year veteran of the department, was assigned as lead investigator. Cole was known for his methodical approach, his refusal to let details slip through the cracks. He'd worked missing persons cases before, but nothing like this. Nothing involving two girls who seemed to have vanished into thin air in broad daylight. In those early days, Cole and his team focused on the most statistically likely scenarios. They looked at boyfriends, ex-boyfriends, anyone who might have had romantic interest in either girl. Jessica had dated a boy named Travis briefly the previous fall, but it had ended amicably and he had an alibi for the afternoon in question. Kacie had been seeing someone casually, a guy named Derek who worked at an auto parts store, but he'd been at work that entire Saturday, confirmed by his manager and time cards. They investigated family members, though no one seriously believed either family was involved. The Hammonds and the Woods families were cooperative, devastated, and clearly desperate for answers. Linda Hammond broke down during her second interview, asking through tears what she was supposed to do, how she was supposed to keep breathing when she didn't know if her daughter was alive or dead. Detectives expanded their search. They looked into known sex offenders in the area, individuals with histories of violence or abduction. They cross-referenced vehicle descriptions with registrations throughout the county. They conducted interviews with dozens of people who'd been at the mall that day, hoping someone had seen something more than what the security cameras had captured. What they found was frustrating in its vagueness. Several witnesses recalled seeing a dark sedan in the parking lot around the time the girls left, but descriptions varied. Some said it was black, others dark blue. Some thought it was a newer model, others disagreed. One teenager thought he'd seen two girls talking to someone near a car, but he couldn't remember what the person looked like, and he wasn't even certain it was the same girls. As February turned into March, the case began to take on the characteristics that define every detective's nightmare: plenty of activity, but no real progress. The community's initial surge of energy and hope began to settle into something heavier, something closer to dread. Search parties continued, but with less frequency. The flyers on telephone poles started to fade in the rain. The news moved on to other stories. For the families, though, nothing moved on. Linda Hammond stopped sleeping more than a few hours a night. She left Jessica's bedroom exactly as it had been, the bed unmade, a library book still open on the nightstand. Kacie's father, Robert Woods, drove through town every evening after work, scanning sidewalks and alleys, as if he might somehow spot his daughter walking home. They attended press conferences together, standing side by side, united in their grief and their refusal to give up hope. What no one could have known at the time was that the person responsible for the girl's disappearance was watching those press conferences, attending those searches. standing among the concerned citizens and volunteers, blending into the community's collective fear and confusion. It's one of the oldest truths in criminal investigation: sometimes the person you're looking for is hiding in plain sight, close enough to hear your suspicions, close enough to adjust their story as needed. Detective Cole felt it, though he couldn't articulate it yet. That sense that something was just slightly wrong, that the answer was closer than they realized. He reviewed files late into the night, looking for patterns, connections, anything that might provide a new direction. But the leads kept drying up. Tips came in daily, most of them well-meaning but ultimately useless. A woman in Tennessee thought she'd seen two girls matching their description at a rest stop. A man in Indiana called to report a vehicle that fit the vague description from the mall. Each lead was followed, each one led nowhere. By the time spring arrived, the investigation had effectively stalled. Cole kept working the case, refusing to let it go cold, but there was simply nothing new to work with. The evidence they had was minimal and circumstantial. Without a body, without a witness who could provide a solid identification, without any physical evidence linking anyone to the crime, they were chasing shadows. The town of Bowling Green tried to return to normal, but there was a permanent shift in the atmosphere. Parents didn't let their children wander as freely. The mall parking lot, once filled on Saturday afternoons, seemed emptier. People locked their doors at night with a new kind of vigilance. The case became a ghost story, the kind of tragedy that people whispered about but tried not to dwell on, because dwelling on it meant confronting how fragile safety really was. Have you ever lived in a town where something terrible happened and was never explained? Where the absence of answers created a kind of permanent anxiety, a feeling that danger might still be present, just waiting? That's what Bowling Green became in the months and years after Jessica and Kacie disappeared. A town living with an open wound. As 1997 turned into 1998, and then 1999, the case began to take on the characteristics of a true cold case. Detective Cole retired in 2001, passing the file to younger investigators who looked at it with fresh eyes but ultimately reached the same dead ends. The physical evidence had been carefully preserved, but there was so little of it. The witness statements had been thoroughly documented, but they were too vague to be useful. The case remained open, but it was no longer active in any meaningful sense. For the families, time moved differently. They marked birthdays that Jessica and Kacie would never celebrate. They attended graduations and weddings for the girls' former classmates, always wondering what their daughters might have become. Linda Hammond started a small support group for families of missing persons, channeling her grief into something that might help others. Robert Woods became an advocate for improved security systems in public spaces, testifying before city councils about the need for better cameras and lighting. But privately, in the quiet moments when hope became too heavy to carry, they wondered if they would ever know what happened. If their daughters had suffered. If they'd been afraid in their final moments. If somewhere, somehow, they were still alive. The community hadn't forgotten, but memory has a way of softening over time. The case became a reference point, a before and after. People still mentioned it occasionally, especially on the anniversary of the disappearance, but it had been absorbed into the town's history, filed away with other tragedies that had no resolution. What no one realized was that the person responsible for Jessica and Kacie's deaths was still living among them. Still going to work, attending church, shopping at the same stores, living what appeared to be a completely normal life. The ability to compartmentalize, to separate one's actions from one's daily existence, is one of the most disturbing aspects of certain types of criminals. They don't appear monstrous. They don't wear their guilt visibly. They simply continue. In the early 2000s, there was a brief surge of renewed interest in the case when a national television program featured unsolved disappearances from the late 1990s. The episode on Jessica and Kacie brought in a new wave of tips, but once again, none led anywhere conclusive. A psychic contacted the police department claiming to have visions about the girl's location, but her information proved to be no more useful than anyone else's speculation. Detective Sarah Mitchell inherited the case in 2004 when she joined the department's cold case unit. Mitchell was younger than Cole had been, less than 30 when she first opened the thick file with Jessica's and Kacie's names on it. She'd been a child herself when they disappeared, growing up 2 towns over, but she remembered the news coverage, the fear it had generated throughout the region. Mitchell approached the case with determination, but also with a realistic understanding of what she was facing. 20 years of investigative technology had advanced significantly since 1997, but technology was only useful if you had evidence to apply it to. She reviewed every witness statement, every piece of physical evidence that had been collected. She re-interviewed some of the original witnesses, now years older, their memories inevitably faded and reshaped by time. One of the things Mitchell focused on was something that Cole had noted but never fully pursued: the social circles around the girls. Not just their immediate friends and romantic interests, but the wider network of people who'd been in their orbit. Teachers, coaches, employers, friends of friends. She created elaborate charts mapping out connections, looking for patterns or individuals who appeared more frequently than might be expected. It was tedious work, the kind that required patience and a tolerance for false starts. Most of the names led nowhere. But Mitchell had a theory, one that she kept mostly to herself because it was based more on instinct than evidence, that whoever had taken Jessica and Kacie had known them, at least peripherally. The girls had gotten into that car willingly, or at least without obvious resistance. That suggested a level of trust or familiarity. But familiarity with whom? That was the question that haunted the investigation. The years continued to pass. 2005 became 2010. The families aged, their hope gradually transforming into something more like acceptance, though they never stopped wanting answers. Linda Hammond's hair turned gray. Robert Woods developed a heart condition his doctors attributed to stress. The support groups and advocacy work helped, gave their pain a purpose, but it didn't bring their daughters home. In Bowling Green, the case receded further into the background. New residents moved to town with no knowledge of what had happened in 1997. The mall where Jessica and Kacie were last seen was renovated, the parking lot repaved, the security system updated with cameras that would have captured everything that mattered, if only they'd existed 2 decades earlier. But in 2012, something shifted. A woman named Angela Brennan, who'd been a junior at Greenwood High School in 1997, contacted Detective Mitchell. Angela had moved away from Bowling Green years ago, built a life in Nashville, and had been in therapy dealing with anxiety and depression. During one of her sessions, a memory had surfaced, something she dismissed at the time but now felt compelled to share. Angela remembered seeing Jessica and Kacie at the mall that Saturday afternoon. But more than that, she remembered seeing them talking to someone in the parking lot. A young woman, maybe in her early 20s, with reddish-brown hair. Angela hadn't thought much of it at the time, had assumed it was someone the girls knew, but the memory had stayed with her in a vague, uncomfortable way. Mitchell took the information seriously, though she was cautious. Memories that resurface after 15 years are notoriously unreliable, subject to distortion and the influence of suggestion. But it was something. A detail that hadn't been in any of the original witness statements. Could the person who'd taken Jessica and Kacie have been a woman? It was a possibility that had been considered briefly in the original investigation, then largely dismissed. Statistically, abductions and violent crimes against teenagers were far more commonly perpetrated by men. But statistics didn't account for every case, and Mitchell knew that tunnel vision, focusing too narrowly on the expected profile, had derailed investigations before. She began looking at the case through this new lens. Who were the young women in Jessica's and Kacie's lives? Were there any who might have had access to them, who might have been in that parking lot, who might have had a reason to harm them? This is where the investigation might have stalled again, lost in speculation and possibilities that couldn't be verified. But something else happened in 2014 that would prove crucial, though no one recognized its significance at the time. A woman named Christine Valerie, who'd been a neighbor of the Woods family back in 1997, was arrested for embezzlement from her employer, a small accounting firm in Bowling Green. It was a relatively minor case, white-collar crime that would normally result in a plea deal and restitution. But during the investigation into Christine's financial records and personal life, something caught the attention of the detective handling her case. Christine had kept journals. Dozens of them, spanning years, detailing her thoughts, her frustrations, her resentments. And buried in the pages of a journal from 1997, there were references to Kacie Woods. Not many, just a few scattered mentions, but enough to be notable. Christine had been friendly with the Woods family. She'd occasionally babysat Kacie when Kacie was younger. She'd been in her early 20s in 1997, living just 2 houses down. The detective on the embezzlement case mentioned this to a colleague, who mentioned it to someone else, and eventually, the information made its way to Mitchell. It was tenuous, the thinnest of threads, but Mitchell had learned to follow threads. She obtained the journals through proper legal channels and read them carefully. Most of it was mundane, the kinds of daily observations and complaints anyone might write. But there were passages that stood out. Christine wrote about feeling invisible, about being overlooked and underestimated. She wrote about watching people live their lives with an envy that sometimes tipped into bitterness. And she wrote about Kacie with a strange intensity, describing her as naive, ungrateful for what she had, too pretty and too confident for her own good. None of it was explicitly incriminating. But it suggested a psychology that made Mitchell uneasy. She began digging into Christine Valerie's background more thoroughly. Christine Valerie had grown up in Bowling Green, the middle child in a family of 5. By most accounts, her childhood had been unremarkable, neither particularly happy nor notably troubled. She'd graduated from high school with average grades, attended community college for a year before dropping out, and drifted through a series of administrative and clerical jobs. She'd never married, had few close friendships, and lived a quiet, unobtrusive life. In 1997, when Jessica and Kacie disappeared, Christine had been 23 years old. She'd been living in a rental house on Maple Street, the same street where the Woods family lived. She'd been interviewed as part of the original investigation, along with every other neighbor, but the interview had been brief and unremarkable. She'd said she didn't know the girls well, hadn't seen them that day, and hoped they'd be found safe. Nothing in her demeanor or her responses had raised suspicion. Mitchell pulled the original interview report and read it again with new eyes. It was perfunctory, the kind of conversation that would have taken 5 minutes. No one had had any reason to look at Christine more closely. But now, 17 years later, Mitchell had those journals. And she had Angela Brennan's memory of a young woman with reddish-brown hair in the parking lot. Christine Valerie had reddish-brown hair in 1997. Mitchell knew she was working with fragments, pieces that might not fit together at all. But she also knew that cold cases were often solved not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through the slow accumulation of small details that finally reached a critical mass. She needed more. She began the painstaking process of reconstructing Christine's life in February 1997. She pulled financial records, work schedules, phone records from that period. She re-interviewed people who'd known Christine back then, asking careful questions that wouldn't reveal the direction of the investigation. What emerged was a picture of someone who'd been struggling, though she'd hidden it well. Christine had lost her job in January 1997, fired for attendance issues. She'd been in debt, facing eviction from her rental house. Her journals from that period reflected increasing desperation and anger, a sense that life was fundamentally unfair and that everyone around her was succeeding while she failed. And then, after February 15, 1997, her circumstances had suddenly improved. She'd found a new job within 2 weeks. She'd paid off several debts. There were gaps in her journal entries around that time, days where she wrote nothing at all, which was unusual for someone who'd been writing daily. Mitchell brought this information to her supervisor, explaining her theory carefully. It was still circumstantial, still built on inference and possibility rather than concrete evidence. But it was enough to justify taking the next step. In September 2015, Mitchell visited Christine Valerie at her home, this time not for a routine follow-up, but for a formal interview at the police station. Christine agreed to come involuntarily, showing no visible signs of concern. She sat across from Mitchell in the small interview room, her hands folded calmly on the table, her expression mildly curious. Mitchell began with general questions, establishing rapport, asking Christine to recount what she remembered about 1997, about living on Maple Street, about the Woods family. Christine answered easily, her voice steady. She remembered the disappearance, of course. Everyone in town remembered. Such a terrible thing. She'd participated in some of the early searches, she said. She'd wanted to help. Then Mitchell began to press slightly, asking about Christine's own life during that time. Her job loss, her financial troubles. Christine's expression tightened, but she acknowledged these facts. They were a matter of record, after all. Yes, she'd been going through a difficult period. But lots of people had financial problems. It didn't mean anything. Mitchell asked about the sudden improvement in Christine's situation after February. The new job, the paid debts. Christine explained that she'd borrowed money from a relative. She'd been lucky to find work quickly. She didn't see what any of this had to do with two missing girls. The interview lasted 3 hours. By the end, Christine was less composed, more defensive, but she hadn't admitted anything. She hadn't requested a lawyer. She'd simply insisted, repeatedly, that she didn't know what had happened to Jessica and Kacie, and she was tired of answering questions about a tragedy that had occurred nearly 20 years ago. Mitchell let her go. There wasn't enough to hold her, and pushing too hard too soon could jeopardize everything. But as Christine left the station, Mitchell felt certain of one thing: she was hiding something. The investigation into Christine Valerie intensified over the following months. Mitchell obtained a warrant for Christine's current home, searching for anything that might connect her to the 1997 case. What they found was more journals, continuing the pattern from years before. And in a storage box in her attic, they found photographs. Among them were pictures from 1997. Christine at community events. Christine at searches for the missing girls, standing in groups of volunteers, her face appropriately somber. And tucked in the back of a photo album, a picture of Kacie Woods, much younger, maybe 13 or 14, smiling at the camera. It was the kind of photo a family member might keep, or a very close friend. But Christine had claimed she barely knew Kacie. Mitchell also found something else in the storage box, a small spiral notebook with dates and observations. It took her a while to understand what she was looking at, but gradually the pattern became clear. Christine had been watching people. Taking notes on their routines, their habits, who they spent time with. Most of the entries were from the mid-1990s. And several pages were devoted to Kacie Woods. When she left for school. When she came home. Who she talked to. Where she went on weekends. It was obsessive and disturbing, the kind of documentation that suggested Christine's interest in Kacie had been far more intense than she'd ever admitted. But even this wasn't enough for an arrest. There was nothing that directly connected Christine to the day Jessica and Kacie disappeared. Nothing that proved she'd done anything more than harbor an unhealthy fixation. Mitchell needed something more concrete. She needed physical evidence. And in early 2016, she finally found a path forward. Advances in forensic technology had made it possible to extract DNA from items that had been processed years earlier. Mitchell went back through the original evidence from the case, looking for anything that might have been overlooked or inadequately tested in 1997. There wasn't much. No bodies had been found. The few items that had been collected from the mall parking lot, cigarette butts and trash, had been tested but yielded nothing useful. But Mitchell remembered something from the case file. A baseball cap that had been found in a dumpster behind the mall 2 days after the girls disappeared. It had been turned in by a worker who'd thought it might be relevant, though it hadn't matched either girl's clothing description from that day. It had been tested for DNA in 1997, but the technology then had been limited, and the results had been inconclusive. Mitchell requested that the cap be retested with current technology. It was a long shot, but she'd learned that cold cases were solved through long shots. The results came back in April 2016. There were multiple DNA profiles on the cap, degraded but recoverable. One was male, never identified. But another was female. And when it was run through the state database, there was a hit. Christine Valerie. Suddenly, Mitchell had something tangible. Christine's DNA on a piece of evidence found near the location where 2 girls had disappeared, found shortly after that disappearance. It wasn't conclusive on its own. Christine could argue she'd been at the mall around that time, could have lost a cap there innocently. But combined with everything else, the journals, the photos, the obsessive notes, the lies about how well she'd known the victims, it was enough. On May 3, 2016, Christine Valerie was arrested and charged with 2 counts of kidnapping and 2 counts of murder in the deaths of Jessica Hammond and Kacie Woods. The arrest shocked Bowling Green. Many residents had no memory of Christine, or remembered her only vaguely as a quiet woman who'd lived in town for years. The idea that someone so ordinary, someone who'd participated in searches and expressed sympathy, could be responsible for such a horrific crime was almost incomprehensible. But as details began to emerge, as journalists dug into Christine's background and her journals were described in court filings, a picture emerged of someone who'd been deeply troubled, driven by jealousy and resentment, capable of violence that she'd hidden behind a mask of normalcy for nearly 2 decades. The question everyone wanted answered was, what had actually happened that day in February 1997? And where were Jessica and Kacie's bodies? Christine Valerie initially maintained her innocence, insisting through her attorney that the DNA evidence could be explained, that her journals were private thoughts that meant nothing, that she was being persecuted for being strange rather than criminal. But as the prosecution built its case throughout 2016 and early 2017, as the weight of circumstantial evidence accumulated, something inside Christine began to crack. Investigators had continued working even after the arrest, searching for Jessica's and Kacie's remains. Christine's movements in the days and weeks after February 15, 1997, were reconstructed as thoroughly as possible. She'd had access to a vehicle, an older model sedan that matched witness descriptions from the mall. She'd made several trips out of town in late February and early March of 1997, according to old credit card records. One of those trips had taken her to a rural area in northern Tennessee, near the Kentucky border, a region of dense forest and isolated roads. In October 2016, a search team working off this information found remains in a wooded area off Highway 31E, about 40 miles south of Bowling Green. The remains were scattered, degraded by nearly 20 years of exposure and wildlife activity, but dental records confirmed what everyone already knew in their hearts. They'd found Jessica Hammond and Kacie Woods. The discovery broke the families all over again, even as it provided a terrible kind of closure. Linda Hammond collapsed when she received the news, had to be hospitalized for exhaustion and grief. Robert Woods stood silently in his living room, staring at nothing, tears running down his face, finally able to say with certainty that his daughter wasn't coming home, that she'd been gone all along. For the community, the discovery was devastating but necessary. There were funerals, finally, after 19 years of not knowing. The town gathered to mourn properly, to lay Jessica and Kacie to rest with the dignity they deserved. The churches were filled. The grief was overwhelming. But there was still the question of why. What had driven Christine Valerie to do this? What had happened in that parking lot, in those terrible hours after the girls got into her car? Christine remained silent for months, even as her legal situation became increasingly precarious. The evidence against her was substantial. Her DNA at the scene. Her documented obsession with one of the victims. Her lies to police. The discovery of the bodies in a location she'd visited shortly after the disappearance. Her attorneys advised her that a confession and cooperation might be her only chance at avoiding a death sentence. In January 2017, facing the reality of her situation, Christine Valerie finally agreed to talk. What she described in her confession was chilling in its banality. She'd seen Kacie and Jessica at the mall that afternoon. She'd been there herself, unemployed and aimless, watching people shop with money she didn't have. She'd recognized Kacie, the girl from down the street who'd grown into everything Christine wasn't: pretty, confident, loved. And seeing her there with her friend, laughing about something, so carefree and unaware of how good they had it, something inside Christine had snapped. She'd approached them in the parking lot. She'd told them her car was having trouble, asked if they could help her, just come look at the engine for a moment. It was the kind of request that seemed harmless, the kind that teenagers might agree to without thinking twice, especially coming from a neighbor, someone familiar. They'd walked over to her car. And once they were close, once she had them near the open trunk, she'd pulled out a gun, a small revolver she'd bought years earlier and never told anyone about. She'd forced them into the trunk. The entire encounter had taken less than 3 minutes. She'd driven south, out of Bowling Green, onto back roads where traffic was sparse. She'd parked in the woods, far from any houses or roads. And there, in that isolated place, she'd killed them. First Kacie, then Jessica. She described it matter-of-factly, without emotion, as if recounting a routine task. Jessica had begged. Kacie had tried to fight. Neither had mattered. Why had she done it? Christine struggled to articulate a reason even she could understand. She talked about years of feeling invisible, of watching other people be happy while she was miserable, of a resentment that had built up like pressure with no release. She'd wanted, just once, to be the one with power. To make someone else feel helpless the way she'd always felt helpless. It wasn't rational. It wasn't justified. It simply was. The confession was recorded, transcribed, and would later be used in court. But for the families, for the detectives, for everyone who'd spent 19 years wondering what had happened, the explanation felt hollow. Because there was no explanation that could make sense of taking 2 young lives for no reason other than jealousy and rage. Christine Valerie's case moved through the legal system with a grim inevitability. In March 2017, she pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder as part of an agreement that took the death penalty off the table. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke directly to Christine, telling her that she would spend the rest of her life thinking about what she'd done, about the futures she'd stolen, about the families she'd destroyed. Christine showed little reaction. She was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and the families were left to process what justice looked like when it came 19 years too late. For Linda Hammond and Robert Woods, the resolution was complex and painful. They'd finally gotten answers. They knew what had happened to their daughters. They knew where to visit them, where to bring flowers and stand in silence and feel close to them again. But the knowing didn't erase the years of not knowing. It didn't bring Jessica and Kacie back. It didn't undo the decades of pain and uncertainty. Linda Hammond spoke at the sentencing hearing, reading a statement she'd written by hand. Her voice broke multiple times, but she pushed through. She talked about Jessica's kindness, her love of poetry, her gentle spirit. She talked about missing 19 years of her daughter's life, about grandchildren she would never have, about the ordinary moments, birthdays and holidays and quiet evenings, that had been stolen. She looked directly at Christine and asked how someone could do this, how someone could live with themselves afterward, knowing what they'd done. Christine didn't answer. She didn't look up. Robert Woods chose not to speak at the hearing. He told reporters afterward that he had nothing to say to Christine Valerie, that she'd taken enough from him already. But he thanked Detective Mitchell and the other investigators who'd refused to give up on the case. He said he'd spent 19 years wondering if he'd failed his daughter somehow, if there was something he should have done differently. Now he knew that there was nothing he could have done. That evil had simply been living 2 houses down, wearing a friendly face, waiting for an opportunity. Detective Sarah Mitchell, who'd worked the case for more than a decade, felt the weight of the resolution in her own way. There was satisfaction in having solved it, in finally being able to give the families answers. But there was also the knowledge that justice delayed was still a form of injustice. If the technology had existed in 1997 to test that baseball cap the way it had been tested in 2016, Christine might have been caught immediately. If the original investigation had looked more carefully at the people closest to the victims, at the neighbors and acquaintances, Christine might not have been overlooked. 19 years was a long time for a guilty person to walk free. But Mitchell also knew that cold cases were solved through persistence, through refusing to accept that some questions would never be answered. The case had stayed open because people like Detective Cole, even after retirement, had kept it alive, had passed it on to investigators who cared. The case had been solved because someone had been willing to look at old evidence with new eyes, to follow threads that seemed impossibly thin, to believe that the truth could still be found even after 2 decades of silence. The town of Bowling Green struggled with its own complicated feelings. There was relief that the mystery had been solved, that the person responsible was in prison. But there was also a deep discomfort with the realization that Christine Valerie had been among them all along. She'd worked in local businesses. She'd attended community events. She'd expressed sympathy for the victims' families while knowing exactly what had happened to their daughters. How many people had spoken to her casually over the years, had no idea they were talking to a murderer? How many times had she walked past memorials for Jessica and Kacie, had seen their photographs on posters and flyers, and felt nothing? It forced a reckoning with the nature of evil itself, with the fact that it doesn't always announce itself. It hides. It blends in. It wears the face of an ordinary person living an ordinary life, and only reveals itself when it's safe to do so, or when it finally has no choice. In the months following Christine's sentencing, Bowling Green held a memorial service for Jessica Hammond and Kacie Woods. It was held on a Saturday afternoon in May, almost exactly 20 years after they'd disappeared, in a park not far from where they'd grown up. Hundreds of people attended. Some had known the girls personally, had been classmates or friends or neighbors. Others had never met them but had lived with their absence, had felt the shadow of their disappearance over the town for 2 decades. There was a remembrance wall where people could write messages. Former classmates wrote about memories they'd held onto, moments that seemed insignificant at the time but had taken on profound meaning after Jessica and Kacie were gone. Teachers wrote about students they'd never forgotten. Strangers wrote apologies for not doing more, for letting the case fade from daily consciousness, for moving on with their lives while 2 families remained frozen in grief. Linda Hammond and Robert Woods stood together at the memorial, accepting condolences, thanking people for coming, for remembering. They'd aged visibly in the years since 1997, the weight of loss written in the lines of their faces. But there was something different about them now, something that hadn't been there before. Not peace, exactly. But maybe the beginning of it. The ability to breathe a little easier, knowing that their daughter's story had an ending, even if it wasn't the ending anyone wanted. The service included readings, music that Jessica and Kacie had loved, testimonials from friends who'd never stopped missing them. There was a moment of silence that stretched long and heavy, filled with all the words that could never be spoken, all the years that could never be reclaimed. And then there was a release of balloons, white and gold, rising into the evening sky, carrying with them the hope that somewhere, somehow, Jessica and Kacie knew they hadn't been forgotten. In the years since Christine Valerie's conviction, the case has been studied by law enforcement agencies as an example of how cold cases can be solved through persistence and evolving technology. Detective Mitchell has spoken at conferences about the investigation, emphasizing the importance of never closing a case completely, of preserving evidence properly, of being willing to reconsider old assumptions when new information emerges. The baseball cap that contained Christine's DNA is now used in training seminars as a reminder that evidence collected years ago might hold answers that weren't accessible at the time. The case has also become a cautionary tale about the limits of our ability to know who people really are. Christine Valerie had no criminal history before 1997. Nothing in her background would have predicted violence. She was, by all outward appearances, unremarkable, forgettable even. And that ordinariness had been her camouflage, the thing that had allowed her to hide in plain sight for so long. Psychologists who've reviewed the case have noted that Christine's journals revealed a personality characterized by profound insecurity and resentment, by a tendency to externalize blame for her problems, by a complete lack of empathy for others. These traits don't inevitably lead to violence, but in Christine's case, combined with opportunity and circumstance, they'd created someone capable of unthinkable cruelty. What the case ultimately revealed was something uncomfortable but important: that safety is more fragile than we want to believe, that evil can be subtle and patient, and that justice, when it finally comes, is often bittersweet. Today, more than 20 years after their deaths, Jessica Hammond and Kacie Woods are remembered not as victims, but as the people they were. There are scholarships in their names at Greenwood High School, awarded annually to students who embody the qualities Jessica and Kacie represented: kindness, creativity, friendship, hope. There's a small memorial garden in Bowling Green with benches where people can sit and reflect, surrounded by flowers that bloom every spring, a reminder of lives that ended too soon but continue to mean something. Linda Hammond eventually wrote a book about her experience, not about the crime itself but about living with loss, about navigating grief when there are no answers, about finding ways to honor a child's memory when you can't hold them anymore. The book has helped other families dealing with similar tragedies, has given them permission to grieve in their own way, on their own timeline. Robert Woods became involved with organizations that advocate for improved missing persons investigations, that push for better resources and training for law enforcement, that work to ensure evidence is properly preserved and cases are never truly abandoned. He's testified before state legislatures about the importance of funding cold case units, of maintaining databases, of investing in forensic technology that might not show results for years but can eventually make the difference between justice and its absence. Their pain hasn't disappeared. It's still there, will always be there. But it's been channeled into something purposeful, something that honors Jessica and Kacie by trying to prevent other families from enduring what they've endured. Christine Valerie remains in prison, serving her life sentence at a facility in Kentucky. She's granted few interviews and has shown little remorse beyond acknowledging the basic facts of what she did. Psychologists who've evaluated her have described her as emotionally flat, disconnected from the weight of her actions. Whether she's capable of genuine remorse or simply incapable of feeling it remains unclear. Either way, she'll spend the rest of her life behind bars, and for many people, that's the only justice that matters. The case of Jessica Hammond and Kacie Woods is a reminder of several truths that those of us who study true crime understand but sometimes forget. It's a reminder that time doesn't diminish the importance of justice, that families deserve answers no matter how many years have passed. It's a reminder that investigations require patience and persistence, that evidence collected today might be crucial tomorrow, that technology evolves and cases once thought unsolvable can be reopened with new tools and new perspectives. But more than anything, it's a reminder that behind every case, behind every file number and evidence log and investigation report, there are real people. People who lived and loved and had dreams for the future. People whose absence leaves permanent scars on those who knew them. People who deserved better than what happened to them. Jessica Hammond was 16 years old when she died. She'd written poetry that her mother still keeps in a box, along with photographs and her favorite books and all the small treasures that make up a life. She'd wanted to be a teacher someday. She'd loved rainy afternoons and old movies and the feeling of a brand new notebook full of blank pages. She'd been kind to everyone, even people who weren't kind to her. She'd made her mother laugh. She'd been loved beyond measure. Kacie Woods was 18 years old. She'd been planning to travel, to see places beyond Bowling Green, to figure out who she was going to become. She'd been saving money from her job at the clothing store. She'd had a laugh that her father said could light up a room. She'd been loyal to her friends, protective of people she cared about. She'd been excited about the future, about all the possibilities ahead of her. She'd been loved beyond measure. They deserve to grow old. They deserve to make mistakes and learn from them, to fall in love and have their hearts broken and fall in love again. They deserved ordinary lives filled with ordinary moments that only become extraordinary when you realize they could be taken away in an instant. That's what Christine Valerie stole from them. Not just their lives, but every moment that would have followed. Every birthday, every accomplishment, every quiet evening and loud celebration and mundane Tuesday afternoon. She stole their futures, and she stole them from everyone who loved them. And she did it for no reason that makes sense, because there is no reason that could ever make sense. But the story doesn't end with Christine. It ends with the families who refused to give up. With the investigators who kept working long after most people had moved on. With the community that continued to remember, even when remembering was painful. With the persistence that eventually led to answers, to accountability, to a kind of justice that arrived decades late but still mattered. Because that's what we owe to victims like Jessica and Kacie. We owe them memory. We owe them the refusal to let their stories disappear. We owe them the commitment to keep searching for truth, no matter how long it takes. And we owe them the promise that their lives, however brief, will continue to mean something. That they won't be reduced to statistics or forgotten cases. That their names will be spoken with love and respect. That their deaths will push us to be better, to create systems and communities where fewer people fall through the cracks, where justice comes faster, where families don't have to wait 19 years for answers. That's the legacy of Jessica Hammond and Kacie Woods. Not the tragedy of how they died, but the impact of how they're remembered. These stories are for people who understand that the truth matters, even when it's difficult. Even when it arrives too late. Even when it can't undo the harm that's been done. You stayed with this story from beginning to end, through years of investigation and dead ends and eventual resolution, because you believe that every victim deserves justice, that every family deserves answers, that time doesn't erase the importance of the truth. That kind of commitment is rare. It's what drives investigators like Sarah Mitchell to keep working cases long after others have given up. It's what drives families like the Hammonds and the Woods to keep fighting for their children even when hope seems impossible. And it's what drives channels like this one to keep telling these stories, to make sure that victims aren't forgotten, that their lives continue to matter. This channel exists because of people like you. People who don't look away from difficult truths. People who understand that true crime isn't entertainment, it's documentation of real lives and real loss. People who believe that bearing witness to these stories is itself a form of honoring the victims. These cases take time to research, to write, to present with the respect they deserve. Your support, through watching, subscribing, sharing, makes it possible to continue this work. To keep bringing you stories that deserve to be told, cases that deserve to be remembered. So if you made it this far, if Jessica's and Kacie's story affected you the way it affected me while researching it, I want to ask you something. What part of this case stayed with you the most? Was it the family's persistence? The years of not knowing? The ordinariness of the person responsible? Drop a comment and let me know. These conversations matter. They keep these stories alive. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who understands why these stories matter. Because every subscription, every view, every share helps ensure that victims like Jessica Hammond and Kacie Woods aren't forgotten. That their stories reach people who need to hear them. That justice, even when it's delayed, is still worth fighting for. Thank you for being here. For listening. For caring. For being the kind of person who believes that truth and memory and justice matter, even 2 decades later. Rest in peace, Jessica Hammond and Kacie Woods. Your lives mattered. Your story matters. And you will not be forgotten. I'll see you in the next one.